Ever had a neighbor from hell? This story might just top them all. Want to hear how a simple barbecue turned into a full-blown police investigation? Subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't regret it. The story begins with Brian, a man who takes pride in his home and enjoys the simple pleasures of life, preparing a Saturday afternoon barbecue. The scene quickly transforms from a relaxed gathering with friends to a heated confrontation with his neighbor, Karen, who escalates the situation dramatically by calling the police, making outlandish accusations of harassment and even questioning Brian's homeownership, claiming he's homeless. This key point establishes the core conflict and the characters' initial positions. Brian hummed along to a classic rock tune, carefully arranging the charcoal briquettes in his well-worn Weber grill. He was a creature of habit, and his Saturday BBQs were a sacred ritual, a chance to unwind after a long week of work and enjoy the company of good friends. The sun was shining, casting a warm golden glow over his meticulously maintained backyard. He'd spent the last few months transforming it into his personal sanctuary, a new patio, carefully chosen outdoor furniture, and even a small herb garden that provided fresh basil and rosemary for his culinary creations. Today's menu was ambitious: slow-smoked ribs, juicy chicken thighs marinated in his secret blend of spices, and sweet corn on the cob, slathered in butter and sprinkled with chili flakes. He inhaled deeply, savoring the anticipation of the smoky flavors that would soon fill the air. His friends, Mark and Jessica, were due to arrive any minute. Mark, a childhood friend with a booming laugh and an endless supply of jokes, was always the life of the party. Jessica, Mark's wife, was a calming presence, a sharp contrast to Mark's boisterous energy, but equally cherished. Brian valued their friendship immensely. They were his chosen family. He checked his watch, a sturdy diver's watch he'd treated himself to after a particularly successful project at work. He appreciated quality and craftsmanship, and the watch was a reminder of his hard work and dedication. He carefully placed the seasoned ribs on the grill, the sizzle a welcome sound. The hickory wood chips he'd added to the coals began to release their fragrant smoke, a scent that, to Brian, was synonymous with relaxation and good times. He closed the lid, allowing the magic of low and slow cooking to work its wonders. He then turned his attention to the chicken, meticulously arranging the thighs on the cooler side of the grill. Suddenly, a voice, sharp and piercing, cut through the tranquil afternoon air. "Yo, what in the world do you think you're doing?" Brian turned to see Karen, his next-door neighbor, standing at the edge of his property, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her face a mask of disapproval. Karen was a woman of a certain age, with a permanent frown etched onto her face and a reputation for being, to put it mildly, difficult. Brian had tried to be neighborly, offering to help with her groceries and shoveling her walkway during the winter, but she'd always met his kindness with suspicion and curt replies. He forced a smile. "Just having a barbecue, Karen. Beautiful day for it, isn't it?" Karen's eyes narrowed, focusing on the gentle plume of smoke rising from the grill. "That smoke is absolutely atrocious. It's billowing into my house and giving me a splitting headache. It's like living next to a chimney." Brian was taken aback. The smoke was minimal, and the wind was carrying most of it away from her property. "I'm sorry you're not feeling well, Karen, but I really don't think the smoke is that bad. It's mostly going straight up." "Don't you dare try to gaslight me," she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. "You're doing this on purpose. You know I have sensitivities. This is deliberate harassment." Brian felt a surge of frustration. He'd dealt with Karen's complaints before, about everything from the color of his flowers to the volume of his music, but this was a new level of absurdity. "Karen, with all due respect, that's ridiculous. I'm just cooking my dinner. I'm not trying to harass anyone." At that moment, Mark and Jessica arrived, their cheerful greetings momentarily drowning out Karen's ranting. They stopped short, sensing the tension in the air. "What's going on?" Mark asked, looking from Brian to the visibly agitated Karen. This person," Karen spat, pointing a trembling finger at Brian, "is intentionally polluting my air with his disgusting smoke. He's trying to drive me out of my own home." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Karen, it's just a barbecue. I'm sure Brian didn't mean to upset you." Karen ignored Jessica, her focus entirely on Brian. "You don't even belong here. This is a respectable neighborhood and you're clearly homeless. Look at you." Brian's jaw dropped. He glanced down at his clothes, A perfectly normal, if slightly worn, band t-shirt and a pair of comfortable cargo shorts. He was clean-shaven, his hair neatly trimmed. He couldn't fathom where she was getting this idea. "Karen," he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed anger, "I live here. I own this house. I've lived here for 5 years." Karen let out a derisive snort. "You own this house? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You're squatting, that's what you're doing. I've seen you sneaking around like a rat. You probably don't even have a job." Brian felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He had a successful career as a software engineer, working from home most days. He'd poured his heart and soul into renovating his house, making it his own. "I'm calling the police," Karen declared, pulling out her phone with a smug expression. "They'll sort you out. They'll see that you're just a vagrant trying to cause trouble." Brian stood there, speechless, as Karen dialed 911. Mark and Jessica exchanged bewildered glances. The smell of delicious barbecue was now completely overshadowed by the stench of Karen's bitter accusations and the looming threat of police intervention. Brian knew this was going to be a long afternoon. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure, but a knot of anxiety was tightening in his stomach. He had all the necessary documents to prove his homeownership, but he dreaded the hassle and the sheer absurdity of having to defend himself against such a ludicrous claim. He glanced at his grill, the ribs and chicken now a secondary concern. His perfect Saturday afternoon had just been completely derailed. The police arrived, 2 officers, Officer Miller, a seasoned veteran, and Officer Davis, a younger, more by-the-book officer, and assessed the situation. Karen continues her dramatic accusations, while Brian, increasingly frustrated, tries to present his side of the story. The officers begin their investigation, questioning both Brian and Karen, and inspecting Brian's property, leading to a tense and uncertain atmosphere. The wail of sirens pierced the afternoon air, growing louder as the police cruiser pulled up to the curb in front of Brian's house. Brian felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach, despite knowing he'd done nothing wrong. He'd always been a law-abiding citizen, and this was his first real encounter with the police, a situation made all the more surreal by its utter absurdity. 2 officers emerged from the vehicle. Officer Miller, a man in his late 40s with a calm, almost weary demeanor, and Officer Davis, a younger officer with a neatly trimmed mustache and a more formal bearing. Karen rushed towards them, her voice shrill and breathless. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man is harassing me. He's deliberately filling my house with smoke and he's trespassing. He doesn't even live here. He's homeless." Officer Miller held up a hand, silencing her momentarily. "Ma'am, we need to assess the situation. Please calm down and tell us what happened, one at a time." He turned to Brian, his expression neutral. "Sir, can you tell us your side of the story?" Brian took a deep breath, trying to remain calm and collected. "My name is Brian Thompson and I own this house. I was having a barbecue with my friends, Mark and Jessica." He gestured towards his friends who were standing awkwardly by the grill, "when my neighbor Karen started accusing me of harassing her with the smoke and claiming I'm homeless." Officer Davis, who had been taking notes, looked up. "She claims you don't live here, sir?" "That's correct, officer. It's completely untrue. I have all the paperwork to prove I own this property. I've lived here for 5 years." Karen scoffed loudly. "He's lying. He's a squatter. He probably forged those documents." Officer Miller turned his attention back to Karen. "Ma'am, we need to investigate this properly. We'll need to see some identification from both of you, and any documentation you have regarding ownership of this property, sir." Brian nodded. "Absolutely, officer. I have my driver's license, the deed to the house, utility bills, everything. It's all inside." As Brian went inside to retrieve his documents, Officer Davis began questioning Karen, trying to get a clearer picture of her side of story. Karen continued her tirade, embellishing her story with each retelling, claiming Brian had threatened her, that he was unstable, and that she feared for her safety. Officer Miller, meanwhile, walked around the perimeter of Brian's backyard, observing the grill, the patio furniture, and the general condition of the property. He noticed the well-maintained lawn, the blooming flower beds, and the overall sense of orderliness, which seemed inconsistent with Karen's claims of a homeless squatter. Mark and Jessica, feeling increasingly uncomfortable, offered their statements to Officer Miller, corroborating Brian's version of events. They emphasized that Brian had been nothing but polite and respectful to Karen, even in the face of her escalating accusations. Brian returned with a thick folder containing his house documents. He handed them to Officer Davis, who meticulously reviewed them. The deed, the mortgage statement, property tax records, and several utility bills, all clearly showing Brian Thompson as the owner of the property. Officer Davis looked up at Officer Miller, a slight nod indicating that the documents appeared to be legitimate. Officer Miller then addressed Karen. "Ma'am, Mr. Thompson has provided substantial evidence that he owns this property. Do you have any documentation to support your claim that he doesn't live here?" Karen sputtered, her face turning red. I don't need documents. I know what I see. He's a liar. He's trying to deceive you." Officer Miller sighed. "Ma'am, we need evidence, not just accusations. Based on what we've seen so far, there's no indication that Mr. Thompson is trespassing or harassing you. The smoke from his barbecue is minimal and appears to be a normal activity associated with residential property use." Karen, realizing her accusations were falling apart, started to backpedal, her tone becoming less aggressive and more defensive. "Well, the smoke is bothering me. It's giving me a headache. Can't you do something about that?" Officer Davis stepped in. "Ma'am, while we understand your concern about the smoke, it doesn't appear to be excessive or in violation of any local ordinances. Having a barbecue is a permitted activity." He added the city code. The tension hung heavy in the air. Brian felt a mixture of relief and lingering frustration. He'd proven his ownership, but the whole ordeal had been incredibly stressful and humiliating. He just wanted to enjoy his Saturday afternoon with his friends, but Karen's actions had completely ruined the day. The smell of barbecue now only reminded him of this horrible confrontation. He looked at the officers, expecting them to just leave. As the police prepared to leave, seemingly concluding the matter in Brian's favor, a seemingly offhand comment from Mark triggers a memory for Officer Miller. He recalls a recent neighborhood dispute involving Karen and a previous resident of Brian's house, revealing Karen's long-standing desire to acquire Brian's property at a below-market price, and her history of harassing previous owners to force them to sell. This sheds a new light on the entire situation, exposing Karen's manipulative tactics. Officer Miller, seemingly satisfied with the documentation and the lack of evidence supporting Karen's claims, began to wrap up the investigation. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "it appears this is a neighborly dispute, and there's no evidence of any criminal activity. We advise you both to try to resolve your differences amicably." He turned to Brian. "Mr. Thompson, we apologize for the inconvenience. You're free to continue your barbecue." Brian nodded, relieved but still shaken by the ordeal. He glanced at Mark and Jessica, who offered him supportive smiles. Karen, however, stood fuming, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her face a mask of simmering resentment. As the officers turned to leave, Mark, in an attempt to lighten the mood, made a seemingly innocuous comment. "You know, Brian," he said with a chuckle, "you'd think after all the trouble old Mrs. Henderson caused the previous owner, Karen would be happy to have a normal neighbor for once." Officer Miller, who was halfway to his cruiser, stopped abruptly. He turned back, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Mrs. Henderson?" he asked, looking at Mark. "Did you say Mrs. Henderson?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, she was the one who lived here before Brian. Sweet old lady, but apparently Karen made her life miserable. Constant complaints, threats, even called the city on her multiple times for minor code violations." Officer Miller's expression hardened. A piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. He remembered a series of calls he'd responded to a few years prior, involving a property dispute between a Mrs. Henderson and her neighbor, a woman named Karen Peterson. The details were hazy, but he distinctly recalled the story of harassment and the underlying tension over the property itself. He turned to Officer Davis. "Davis, pull up the records for this address going back 5 years. See if you can find any reports involving a Karen Peterson and an Eleanor Henderson." Officer Davis returned to the cruiser and began searching the database. While they waited, Officer Miller questioned Brian further about Mrs. Henderson. "Did Mrs. Henderson ever mention anything about Karen wanting to buy her property?" he asked. Brian thought for a moment. "Actually, yes. She said Karen had made her a ridiculously low offer a few times, way below market value. She refused, of course, but Karen wouldn't take no for an answer. She kept pestering her. A disturbing pattern was beginning to emerge. It was becoming increasingly clear that Karen's actions weren't just about smoke or perceived homelessness. They were part of a calculated strategy to acquire Brian's property. Officer Davis returned, a grim expression on his face. "Sir, I found multiple reports. Several noise complaints, property line disputes, even an accusation of elder abuse, all filed by Karen Peterson against Eleanor Henderson. All of them were dismissed as unfounded." Officer Miller turned to Karen, his voice now laced with authority. "Mrs. Peterson, it seems we have a history here, don't we? A history of you harassing previous owners of this property in an attempt to force them to sell to you." Karen's face paled. She stammered, I don't know what you're talking about. Those were legitimate complaints." "They were dismissed, Mrs. Peterson," Officer Miller countered. "And Mr. Thompson has provided clear evidence that he owns this property legally. Your accusations today appear to be a continuation of this pattern of harassment." The tables had turned completely. Karen, who had been so confident and aggressive just moments before, was now exposed as a manipulative schemer. Her motive wasn't about smoke or a perceived homeless person. It was about greed and a long-standing desire to acquire Brian's property for her own gain. Brian, Mark, and Jessica watched in stunned silence as the reality of Karen's deception unfolded. The relief Brian had felt earlier was now replaced by a profound sense of anger and betrayal. He'd been targeted not because of anything he'd done, but because of Karen's covetousness and her willingness to use any means necessary to get what she wanted. The air, which was supposed to be filled with barbecue, was filled with a sense of justice. He felt the stare of Karen. It felt like daggers. He knew this wasn't truly the end. With Karen's manipulative scheme exposed, Officer Miller informs her that she could face legal consequences for her false accusations and harassment. He advises Brian on how to obtain a restraining order. Brian, shaken but resolute, decides to take action, not only for himself but to prevent Karen from targeting future neighbors. The story concludes with Brian finally enjoying his barbecue, a sense of peace restored, and the implicit understanding that Karen's reign of terror in the neighborhood is over. Officer Miller turned to Karen, his expression stern. "Mrs. Peterson, you've wasted police resources with false accusations, and you've clearly harassed Mr. Thompson and, based on the history, previous residents of this property. You could be facing charges for filing a false police report, harassment, and potentially even attempted fraud, depending on the extent of your actions." Karen's bravado had completely evaporated. She looked deflated, her eyes darting nervously between the officers and Brian. I just wanted her to sell," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a nice property, I wanted to expand my garden." "That's not an excuse for your behavior, Mrs. Peterson," Officer Davis stated firmly. "You can't harass people into selling their homes to you." Officer Miller addressed Brian. "Mr. Thompson, I strongly recommend you file for a restraining order against Mrs. Peterson. This will legally prevent her from contacting you or coming onto your property. We can provide you with the necessary paperwork." Brian nodded, his jaw set with determination. He'd initially been hesitant to escalate the situation, but Karen's blatant manipulation and the revelation of her past behavior had changed his mind. He wasn't just doing this for himself, he was doing it to protect any future neighbors from Karen's predatory tactics. "Yes, officer, I'll do that." "Thank you." Officer Miller handed Brian a card with information on how to obtain a restraining order and contact information for victim support services. He then turned back to Karen. "Mrs. Peterson, we're not taking you into custody at this time, but you will be receiving a summons to appear in court. You're to have absolutely no contact with Mr. Thompson or his property. Do you understand?" Karen nodded sullenly, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The officers finally left, leaving a palpable sense of relief in their wake. Brian turned to Mark and Jessica, who had witnessed the entire drama unfold. "I can't believe this," he said, shaking his head. "I just wanted to have a barbecue." Mark put a hand on Brian's shoulder. "You handled it like a champ, man. That woman was completely out of line." Jessica added, "She's clearly got some serious issues. I'm glad the police saw through her lies." Brian took a deep breath, the tension slowly starting to dissipate. He looked at his grill, the ribs and chicken still cooking, albeit a little overdone. He salvaged what he could, and they finally sat down to eat, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. The food, while not perfect, tasted incredibly satisfying. It was more than just a meal, it was a symbol of Brian's resilience and his victory over Karen's malicious scheme. He had stood up for himself, defended his home, and exposed a bully. As they ate, they discussed the events of the day, the absurdity of it all, and the relief that it was finally over. Brian knew he would have to deal with the legal process of obtaining a restraining order, but he felt confident that he had the support of the law and the truth on his side. The next few days were spent by Brian contacting a lawyer. He was instructed that he should start gathering testimonials from other neighbors. Brian also made sure to install several security cameras around his property, a precautionary measure against any future attempts at harassment. He felt a newfound sense of vigilance, a determination to protect his home and his peace of mind. The restraining order was granted swiftly, the judge taking a dim view of Karen's history of harassment. Karen was legally barred from contacting Brian or coming within a certain distance of his property. She also faced a hefty fine for filing a false police report. Word of Karen's downfall spread quickly through the neighborhood. Other neighbors, who had long suffered in silence under her reign of petty tyranny, expressed their relief and gratitude to Brian. Some even shared their own stories of Karen's unreasonable behavior, creating a sense of solidarity among the residents. Brian, once the target of Karen's malice, became an unlikely hero, the man who had finally stood up to the neighborhood bully. He continued his Saturday barbecues, the scent of hickory smoke no longer a source of conflict, but a symbol of peace, community, and the quiet enjoyment of his hard-earned home. The fairy lights twinkled, the music played softly, and laughter filled the air, a testament to the enduring power of good neighbors and the triumph of justice. Karen was never seen bothering anyone in the neighborhood again, she was just another person in the background. She learned a lesson even though her garden never expanded. Did that story blow your mind? We've got tons more unbelievable tales from the world of entitled people. Subscribe now, enable notifications, and get ready for your next dose of Reddit drama. And while you're at it, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it.